Good morning. As you can see, I'm not Stuart. I'm up on this upper level. You are welcomed here at Archdale United Methodist Church. It's good to have you with us. If you're visiting with us, we're excited about having you. But come back again because I'm not the regular one. Stuart called me and asked me if I would fill in, so in a weak moment, I said yes, so here I am. This morning, our scripture's coming from Matthew. We're going to talk about the firemen this morning. You remember the hymn? Came from afar, right. Wise men, okay? But before we go to our scripture, I want to go back to last Sunday's service, just a couple thoughts. One reason to let you know that I did not sleep through the whole thing. But there were some points that Stuart made last week in Luke's gospel when he told about the birth story of Jesus and the shepherds coming to visit the Christ child. And a couple points he made, one about the manger. If we'd been putting on the production of the birth, it would have probably been more like a Hollywood production, and it would have been over the top. But in God's plan and in God's will, and this has been something, this is not an accident that just happened, this was in God's plan the whole time. God had to save, after he created mankind, had to figure out a way to save mankind, and this is it. God has intervened in history. God has made his presence known. God has come to earth himself. Not in a palace, but in a manger. Remember how Stuart talked about the stall where Jesus was born. The manger, how much lower can you go? And then the people who recognized who he was. Of course, Joseph and Mary, but look, they had already been visited by the angels, and their faith showed through. They went through with what God's will was for mankind. And then the people that showed up, the shepherds. They're not the upper class of people. They're the least likely. They're the bottom of the rungs of society. They're people that normal people don't even want to associate with. And yet they are the first people that God notified of the birth of the Messiah. Now, in that same vein, we continue to look today at Matthew. And I want you to remember about the story last week as we look at Matthew's gospel this week. We're continuing the Christmas story of the Magi, the wise men. And in the second chapter of Matthew, beginning with the first verse, Matthew says, in the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising, and have come to pay him homage. And when King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all of Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel. And then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. And then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage. And when they had heard the king, they set out. And there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid homage. And then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. May God add his blessings to the hearing, the reading, the hearing, and the understanding of his holy word. There's a lot of sermons could be given from this passage of Scripture, but I want us to focus on three characters, three groups of characters that Matthew introduces us to here. And I want us to think about them, and I want us to think about their response to what God has done. Now, the first group are the Magi, or the wise men. The second is King Herod. And the third are Herod's own wise men, the chief priests and the scribes of the people of Israel. Now, the Magi were the main characters in the story. They're the ones that saw the star. They're the wise men. Now, the thing is that these wise men are pagan Gentiles. They're from the east, probably Persia. Now, we label them as kings, and that might be because we don't actually know, but probably these wise men or Magi were probably priests. They had access to the centers of power in their communities or their regions. These wise men practiced magical arts, including stargazing. Some magi or wise men dabbled in theology or philosophy or even natural sciences. Now, think about this, and think about what Matthew is saying in using these characters here. They're pagan Gentiles, first off, but they're stargazers. And Jews denounced them as magicians or sorcerers. They didn't like them at all. Throughout the rest of the Middle East, perhaps though, they did have some respect among the people. But these magi, or these wise men, were convinced that their studies and their heavenly observations told them about a new king of the Jews that had been born. Now, they wanted to go and pay homage. They wanted to go and see this new king of the Jews. As astrologers and stargazers, they believed that the heavens could open up and witness to the political events of the world, such as a king being born. That's how they recognized the birth of Jesus. They knew that this special sign was a sign of a king. This unusual star that they saw. And see, you can go and read the scriptures and read theologians and scholars, and you can imagine all sorts of things. But why not just say, is it out of the realm of God's power to produce a star? He led the people of Israel with a cloud and a ball of fire for 40 years. This is God's will. This is God's plan. So why not just say that God produced this star that these Gentile pagan worshipers saw? And they wanted to find out about it, this unusual star. So this star has brought them to the center of power of Israel in Jerusalem. Now they come to the normal place that a king would be born. Jerusalem was the capital of Judah. That's where King Herod sat. So that's the normal response. This is where they wound up to greet the new king of the Jews that had been born. Now, when they came in to Jerusalem. The question was, where is the child that has been born the King of the Jews? Now, they asked that question of Herod the Great. And Matthew, in the very beginning of the scripture, has set the time. This is the time in history. It's when King Herod the Great was on the throne of Israel. Now, we'll leave the story just a minute, and I want to talk about King Herod because I want us to set the stage and see what Matthew is telling us here. If you'll remember, the king of Israel was put on the throne by God to shepherd his people, to care for his people, to keep his people faithful. Well, think back over the kings of Israel. That was very few and very far between. Now, this is after Rome has taken over. King Herod was put on the throne in Judah by Rome itself. He was a puppet king. He was appointed by Rome, and when he came in, he laid siege to Jerusalem. He eliminated all the local resistance. He expanded the territory that he ruled. He constructed new public buildings. He even constructed a new palace. He began work on the temple in Jerusalem. He built a port city at Caesarea. He had a good reign, maybe. Politically, he was fairly successful, except for a few grudges from the old enemies that he made when he came into power, such as the Pharisees. They didn't like Herod because he was half Jewish. The Sadducees didn't like Herod because he had just executed 45 of them from the Sanhedrin when he took power. Now, personally, at this time now that Matthew is talking about is later on in his reign. He reigned from about 37 BC to 4. And so as he grows older, he becomes ill physically, and he is filled with paranoia. He has power, and he knows it, and he wants to keep it. Whenever Herod feels threatened or his power is threatened, he acts. Herod's high priest brother-in-law was becoming too popular, and so he met with an accident. He drowned in his swimming pool, and archaeologists say that it wasn't quite 3 foot deep. Herod had 10 wives. Suspecting his favorite wife, of course wrongly, of being unfaithful, he had her strangled to death. He had a bunch of sons, but 2 of them he believed was plotting to overthrow him, so he had them executed. On his deathbed, another son was plotting to overthrow him, so he had him executed. Emperor Augustus was once said to remark that it is safer to be Herod's pig than it is to be his son. Now, the reason I tell you all of this is I want you to understand who he is. Herod is king of Israel. He is the one to lead his people and remain faithful to God. So far in his reign, he has not done that. He has been fairly successful, but he has been consumed with power. When it seems he's threatened, he executes people. He takes care of the problem, even on his deathbed. It was reported that when he died, he left orders that all the elite, the Sanhedrin and all the people close to him, were to be executed. Now, of course, that wasn't carried out. They actually released them, and there was a party. But this is the type of person that was leading his people Israel. Now, when the Magi came, when the wise men came and asked Herod about the new king of the Jews, of course he didn't know. He was part Jewish, but he really didn't know. Now, the thing is, being a member of the body of Israel, they have been looking for a Messiah for centuries. And yet, when it happened, they didn't see it. Now, the third group that I want us to look at very quickly here are Herod's own wise men. They're the chief priests and the scribes. They are the people who belong to Jerusalem's Sanhedrin, or their city council. Whenever Rome moved in or took over a nation or a people, they would always use or collaborate with the existing structure, oftentimes. That way it kept them in, but it also kept them from rebelling against Rome, and that was the main issue. The only thing is that this Sanhedrin, these chief priests and scribes, were not really independent of Herod himself. You remember when Matthew said that Herod was afraid, as well as Jerusalem? This is the people that he's talking about, this part of Jerusalem. Whenever they heard that a new king was being born, what do you think ran through their minds? Well, they were loyal to Herod, and if a new king's being born, where do we stand? He had already replaced all those that were not loyal to him. He had them executed and put people that were loyal to him on the Sanhedrin. Now, this Sanhedrin, these are the religious figures of Israel. They are the governing elite of Israel. They are the priests and the scribes of Israel. They are the experts of the law. These are the people that Herod called to gain information about the birthplace of the Messiah. They came back with information. They knew the scriptures. They went to Micah chapter 5, verse 2. Matthew quotes it in Matthew 2, verse 6. When he says, "And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." If you notice, this verse doesn't actually mention the Messiah, but it does. Even from Micah in the Old Testament, it does anticipate God's reign. And God's reign will end the nation's imperial ambitions. It will be greater than any nation on earth. God's kingdom will come. They recognize that. And this will cause Gentiles to worship Jesus as ruler, as shepherd of his people. These religious leaders know the scripture, but this is what scares me about them. They know the scripture, but they do not know how to read it and relate it to Jesus Christ, the new Messiah that has just been born. They know how to read it, but they do not know enough to go to Bethlehem and to see what God has done. Now, these are the three groups of characters that Matthew uses here. Herod calls the Magi, the wise men, back in. Gives them the information that he's found out from his wise men. And says, what I want you to do is I want you to go and to find this child in Bethlehem. And I want you to send me word because I want to go worship. Duh. Does that sound like Herod? Because this is threatened. He and his elite are already scared to death of this baby. Now, the wise men came to worship a king, or came to bring gifts to a king. They came to Jerusalem. But they go farther. The religious people don't even bother to go to Bethlehem, and yet these wise men who are pagan Gentiles take the time to continue their journey. I wonder if they had questions. Well, is this really a king? He's not being born in Jerusalem. He's been born in Bethlehem. Well, Bethlehem's not that big a deal. And yet they continue their journey. Well, Bethlehem perhaps is a big deal if you remember. That's the place that God found the leader of Israel. The little shepherd boy that he put on the throne of Israel became the greatest king Israel had ever known. And God cared for him enough to promise him that your throne will last forever. Well, this is that fulfillment of that promise. God has come down in history to fulfill a promise he made to a king who was more or less faithful to him. This is the Messiah that Israel has been yearning for years, for centuries. It didn't come as the people expected, though. The wise men continue their journey, and when that star stops, they go into the house, and who do they see? They see Mary and Jesus. And Matthew says that when they see the Messiah, they are overwhelmed with joy. And they fall on their faces and worship. They worship the Messiah. That's not even their Messiah. But he has become their Messiah because they have been open and obedient enough to God to go and see what God has done in history. Now, as I stated earlier, God is in control. This whole scene, God is in control. God warns them in a vision, in a dream, not to go back to Herod. Now, I don't know whether they knew the information about Herod that you do or not, but anyway, they didn't listen to Herod. They listened to the vision. They listened to God. So they went home in another direction. The story's not over there, though. Knowing who Herod is, when he hears the information, Matthew in chapter 2, verse 16 says, when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated. And he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Well, God protected the Messiah. God sent Joseph and Mary and the baby Jesus to Egypt. That's not the first time that God has done that. If you'll remember, when the children of Israel were killed while they were slaves in Egypt, there was one little baby that escaped that death. And that one little baby God brought back to Egypt to free his people Israel. Well, he's done it again. Herod was not able to thwart God's plans God's will was observed. Joseph and Mary were faithful in their encounter with the angel that told them to get out of town. They listened, and Jesus was saved. Now, through each of these characters, Matthew has turned traditional expectations upside down. The Magi, the wise men, were Gentile pagans who came and worshiped Jesus, the Messiah. King Herod. King Herod was the king of Israel who should have known and recognized what God was doing. And yet he acted as a pagan oppressor to the people of Israel. And perhaps the ones that scare me the most are the next group. Herod's wise men, the chief priests and the scribes, the experts in the laws and the scriptures of Israel. They knew the Bible teachings, but they did not act on it. They didn't take it seriously enough to find out about it. Now, the ruler, the puppet king on the throne in Rome, and these Sanhedrin, these priests and scribes and Pharisees, if you think on ahead, became a problem in the life of Jesus. They wanted a Messiah, but Jesus was not the one they wanted, not the one they expected. So God has acted unexpectedly in human nature. The birth of Jesus, God's agent into the sinful world, brings two responses, as we have seen in Matthew's story here. The powerful sinners reject him. The empire strikes back and tries to kill him. Even as a child, they are threatened by who he is and what he is going to become. Now, these are the governing elite. These are the religious people of Israel. And yet, in Matthew's story, just like in Luke's story, it's the insignificant. Those people who are on the fringes of society. Those are the people that recognize what God is doing. The Gentile wise men. The shepherds in Luke's story. And Joseph and Mary, who were they? They were not the upper crust, but they were faithful to God's will. They welcomed God's initiative in history. God's will happened. God's will continues to happen. Jesus was born. Not only was he born, but he grew up and he fulfilled God's will for his life by going to a cross. That's the only way God could figure out that he could welcome us back into his family, is to give us salvation. And I said give it. I didn't say earn it. God gave us. This is an act of God. And oftentimes we get all excited about Christmas, but sometimes it's for the wrong reasons. The wise men, people we would not expect at all, are the ones who recognized what God was doing and what he had done in this baby, and they acted in the right manner. They were overwhelmed with joy, first of all, of what God had done, but then they worshiped. They gave him, as Lorri said, the gifts that they gave him. gold. Well, Mary and Joseph were poor. This gave them the money to flee to Egypt, perhaps. The frankincense. Well, remember, Jesus was born in a stable, and you know how a stable smells. So frankincense would have been good. The myrrh, maybe that was for the health of the child. But they gave him, the Messiah, the gifts that they had. And that's what God is asking and requiring of us, out of gratitude. I think perhaps as they knelt down before this Christ child, I think these wise men, even though pagans and Gentiles, I think they knew exactly who that Messiah was. That was God's gift to all mankind. Just because Israel didn't accept it does not mean that it did not happen, because they accepted it. They were overwhelmed with joy and worshiped God's gift in this Christ child. I hope and I pray that we do the same thing. And in return, fall on our faces before the manger and give our total self to God with joy and gratitude for our salvation. This is the least we can do for this gift of the Christ child. As we continue our worship, as always, the altar's open. But you can experience the birth of the Messiah in your own heart anywhere you are. And I pray that that's what happens this season, this Christmas. Let us worship now by turning to hymn number 251. Go Tell It on the Mountain.